In the summer of 1867, in a remote farming community outside Sedalia, Missouri, 8-year-old Timothy Caldwell became the subject of the most disturbing medical case study ever documented in the American Midwest. Dr. Samuel Harding, the region's only physician, filled 3 leather-bound journals with observations of a child whose behavior defied every principle of human nature known to 19th-century medicine. The boy appeared normal, even charming to casual observers. But beneath his innocent exterior lay something that medical science of the era simply could not explain. For 6 months, 3 people died in accidents around Timothy Caldwell, along with dozens of farm animals found dead under mysterious circumstances. People who had all in some way crossed paths with a child whose smile never reached his pale blue eyes. The official records were sealed by local authorities and hidden away for over a century. But the truth about Timothy Caldwell reveals a darkness that challenges everything we thought we knew about the capacity for evil in childhood. Before we continue with the story of Timothy Caldwell and the terror that gripped Sedalia County, if this story intrigues you, make sure to subscribe to our channel and ring that notification bell so you never miss our deep dives into America's darkest historical mysteries. And please let us know in the comments what state or city you're listening from. We love hearing from our community of mystery enthusiasts around the world. The events that would make Timothy Caldwell infamous began not with violence but with loss. The Missouri of 1867 was a state still bleeding from the wounds of civil war. Towns like Sedalia had sent their young men to die on distant battlefields, leaving behind widows, orphans, and communities struggling to rebuild. The Caldwell farm, nestled in a valley 15 miles south of town, had once been prosperous. James and Martha Caldwell had built their homestead with dreams of raising cattle and corn, but those dreams died with James at the Battle of Wilson's Creek in 1861. Martha tried to maintain the farm alone, but consumption took her lungs in the bitter winter of 1865. Their son Thomas, barely 21, inherited land he couldn't work and debts he couldn't pay. When Thomas received word that his brother William had died at Andersonville prison, leaving behind a widow and 8-year-old son, he saw both burden and opportunity. The boy Timothy would need a home, and Thomas needed help with the endless work of farming. Thomas Caldwell was a hard man, made harder by war and loss. His wife Sarah had grown sharp-tongued and bitter during their childless years. Neither was particularly suited for raising a child, especially one who arrived at their door in the spring of 1866, carrying nothing but a small cloth bag and eyes that seemed far too old for his young face. Timothy Caldwell was small for his age, with pale skin that burned easily in the Missouri sun, and blonde hair that his Aunt Sarah kept cut short to keep the lice away. He spoke little of his life before the farm, offering only fragments when pressed. His father had been a soldier. His mother had coughed blood. He had lived with neighbors for a while after she died. What struck adults most about Timothy was his politeness. He always said, "Yes, sir," and "Yes, ma'am." He never complained about work or punishment. He seemed in every way to be the model of a well-behaved child. Dr. Samuel Harding first encountered Timothy in June of 1866 when the boy accompanied his uncle to town for supplies. Harding, a graduate of the Missouri Medical College and one of the few formally trained physicians west of St. Louis, had developed a keen eye for reading people during his years treating both Union and Confederate soldiers. Something about the Caldwell boy unsettled him, though he couldn't identify what. The child was perfectly respectful, Harding would later write in his journal. He answered questions directly, maintained appropriate eye contact, and displayed none of the fidgeting or shyness typical of rural children encountering strangers. Yet I found myself deeply uncomfortable in his presence. His gaze held an intensity that seemed to suggest he was studying me with the same clinical interest that I typically reserved for my patients. The farming community around Sedalia was small, enough that everyone knew everyone else's business. The Caldwell farm was isolated, but not so isolated that neighbors didn't notice things. Mrs. Elena Patterson, whose property bordered the Caldwell land, would often see Timothy working in the fields or tending to the livestock. She remarked to her husband that the boy worked with unusual focus for a child his age, never seeming to tire, never stopping to play or rest as children naturally do. It was like watching a little machine, she told her husband Samuel over dinner one evening. He'd worked steady from sunrise to sunset, never complaining, never slowing down. Ain't natural for a boy to have no play in him at all. The Patterson farm kept chickens, and Elena noticed that her birds became agitated whenever Timothy was near the property line. They would cluster together, squawking and ruffling their feathers, refusing to venture close to the fence that separated the properties. Her husband dismissed it as coincidence, but Elena couldn't shake the feeling that the animals sensed something about the boy that humans missed. The first death occurred on a sweltering afternoon in August 1866. Little Mary Fletcher, age 5, was the daughter of the town blacksmith, and known throughout the community for her bright laugh and tendency to wander. She had been playing near Willow Creek, a shallow stream that ran between several properties, including the Caldwell farm. Timothy found her body. He arrived at the Fletcher home just as the family was prepared. For supper, his clothes damp, and his face pale with what appeared to be genuine distress. "Mrs. Fletcher," he said, his voice steady despite his obvious agitation, "I found Mary by the creek. She's not breathing." The search party that rushed to the creek found Mary Fletcher face down in water, barely 18 in deep. Dr. Harding, summoned immediately, determined that the child had drowned, a tragic but not uncommon accident in rural areas where children played unsupervised near water. What troubled Harding was not the death itself, but Timothy's account of discovering the body. The boy provided an unusually detailed description of exactly where Mary had been found, the position of her body, and the condition of her clothing. When pressed about how he had come to be in that particular spot at that particular time, Timothy explained that he had been looking for a lost calf. The boy's recall was remarkably precise. Harding noted in his journal, he could describe the exact position of the deceased child's limbs, the way her dress had been caught on a submerged branch, even the color of the water around her face. Such attention to detail seemed unusual for a child who claimed to be frightened and upset by the discovery. Thomas Caldwell, when questioned, confirmed that one of their calves had indeed gone missing that morning, and that he had sent Timothy to search the creek area. The calf was found 2 days later, healthy and grazing in a meadow nearly a mile from where Mary Fletcher had drowned. The Fletcher family, devastated by their loss, received Timothy's sympathy with gratitude. He had, after all, been the one to find their daughter and alert them immediately. At the funeral, Timothy sat quietly with his aunt and uncle, his head bowed respectfully throughout the service. When the family thanked him for his quick action in alerting them, he accepted their gratitude with a appropriate solemnity. "I wish I could have found her sooner," he told Mary's father, his voice carrying just the right note of regret and sorrow. But Elena Patterson, watching from across the church, noticed something that nagged at her for days afterward. When Mary Fletcher's mother collapsed in grief during the service, when the sight of the small coffin reduced grown men to tears, Timothy Caldwell's expression never changed. His head was bowed in apparent sorrow, but when he thought no one was looking, his pale blue eyes remained dry and watchful, taking in every detail of the scene around him. The second death came 3 weeks later. Old Henrik Len, a Norwegian immigrant who had worked as a logger before arthritis forced him into retirement, was found at the bottom of a rocky outcrop known locally as Devil's Bluff. The bluff overlooked the creek where Mary Fletcher had drowned, and Henrik was known to climb there regularly to check on the wild beehives he tended. Once again, Timothy Caldwell was involved in the discovery. He had been walking home from town when he spotted something unusual at the base of the bluff. "I saw Mr. Elson's hat caught on a thorn bush," Timothy told the gathering crowd. "I called out to him but got no answer, so I climbed down to look. Henrik Larsson was dead, his neck broken from what appeared to be a fall from the top of the 40-foot bluff. Dr. Harding's examination revealed that the old man had likely died instantly upon impact. The only unusual aspect of the scene was the presence of several dead bees scattered around the body, far more than would typically be found away from a hive. Mr. Larsson knew those bluffs better than any man in the county. Samuel Patterson told Dr. Harding after the examination he'd been climbing up there for 3 years, never had so much as a stumble. Don't make sense he'd fall now. Timothy, when questioned, suggested that perhaps the old man had been stung by bees and lost his footing. He was always talking about how angry they get when you disturb them. The boy said maybe they swarmed him and he got confused. Dr. Harding found Timothy's explanation plausible, but something about the scene bothered him. The dead bees were all clustered in a small area directly around Henrik's body. If the old man had disturbed a hive at the top of the bluff, there should have been more evidence of bee activity along his presumed path of flight and fall. Instead, it appeared as though the bees had somehow been concentrated around the impact site. When Harding climbed to the top of the bluff to examine the beehives, he found them intact and showing no signs of recent disturbance. The worker bees were active but not agitated, going about their normal business of gathering nectar from the late summer wildflowers. The third death shattered any illusions about coincidence. In September 1866, 6-year-old Jacob Mills vanished while playing in the woods near his family's cabin. His body was found 4 days later in an abandoned well nearly half a mile from where he had last been seen. Timothy Caldwell had volunteered to join the search party. For 3 days, Timothy searched alongside the adult volunteers, showing remarkable endurance for a child his age. He seemed to know the woods intimately, guiding searches through areas that even longtime residents found difficult to navigate. When asked how he had learned the terrain so well, Timothy explained that he often explored the woods during his free time, looking for useful plants and herbs that his aunt could use for cooking and medicine. On the 4th day, Timothy appeared at the Mills cabin just after dawn. "I think I found something," he told Jacob's father, his voice heavy with exhaustion. "There's an old well about a half-mile north of here. I heard what sounded like crying." The well was partially concealed by fallen logs and overgrown brush. Jacob Mills was at the bottom, alive but barely conscious, suffering from dehydration and exposure. Dr. Harding was summoned immediately. But the boy died within hours of being pulled from the well, his small body unable to recover from the ordeal. The child had been at the bottom of that well for nearly 4 days, Harding wrote in his journal. The fact that Timothy Caldwell was able to locate him in such an obscure location raises troubling questions. How extensive is the boy's knowledge of the local terrain? What other hidden dangers might he be aware of? More troubling still was Timothy's behavior during Jacob's final hours. While the Mills family maintained a vigil around their dying son, Timothy sat quietly in the corner of the cabin, apparently praying. But Dr. Harding, positioned where he could observe the boy without being noticed, saw something that deeply disturbed him. Timothy wasn't praying. His lips were moving, but his eyes were fixed on Jacob Mills with an intensity that seemed almost scientific. He appeared to be cataloging every detail of the dying child's condition. The labored breathing, the pale skin, the way consciousness flickered in and out. When Jacob finally died, Timothy's expression showed no grief or shock. Instead, there was something that Harding could only describe as satisfaction. After the funeral, Dr. Harding made an excuse to visit the abandoned well where Jacob had been found. The site troubled him for reasons he couldn't articulate. The well was indeed well hidden, concealed by natural debris that would have taken considerable effort to move. Yet Timothy had claimed to hear crying from this location, a claim that seemed improbable given the depth of the well and the amount of brush covering it. As Harding examined the scene more carefully, he noticed something that the initial rescue party had missed in their urgency to save Jacob Mills. Around the rim of the well, the debris had been arranged with unusual precision. Logs and branches that should have fallen randomly showed signs of deliberate placement, creating a natural-looking camouflage that would be nearly impossible to spot unless one knew exactly where to look. The implications were too disturbing to voice aloud, but Harding could not shake the suspicion that Jacob Mills had not simply fallen into the well. Someone had placed him there, and someone had carefully concealed the location until the boy was too weak to survive rescue. That evening, Harding began keeping detailed notes about Timothy Caldwell. If his suspicions were correct, the boy posed a danger to the entire community. But suspicions were not evidence, and evidence was exactly what Harding lacked. The problem was that Timothy Caldwell was by all appearances a model child. He attended church regularly with his aunt and uncle, sitting quietly through services and reciting prayers with appropriate reverence. He worked diligently on the farm, completing tasks that would challenge many adult workers. He spoke respectfully to his elders and showed proper deference to authority figures. Most importantly, Timothy had plausible explanations for his presence at each tragedy. He had been looking for a lost calf when he found Mary Fletcher. He had been walking home from town when he spotted Henrik Lenn's hat. He had volunteered to help search for Jacob Mills, as any concerned member of the community would do, but Harding's medical training had taught him to look beyond surface appearances. In treating wounded soldiers, he had learned to recognize the signs of men who killed, not from patriotic duty or desperate necessity, but from something darker and more fundamental. There was a coldness in such men, a disconnection from normal human emotion that manifested in subtle ways: too little reaction to horror, too much interest in suffering, an ability to discuss violence with clinical detachment. Timothy Caldwell displayed all of these characteristics, but compressed into the body and face of an 8-year-old child. Dr. Harding's investigation began in earnest in October 1866. Using his position as the community's physician, he made regular visits to farms and homes throughout the area, ostensibly checking on the health of families still recovering from the hardships of war. In reality, he was gathering information about Timothy Caldwell. What he discovered painted a disturbing picture of a child who seemed to exist at the center of an ever-widening circle of misfortune. Livestock on neighboring farms had been dying at unusual rates, not from disease, but from what appeared to be accidental injuries. Chickens were found with broken necks, apparently killed by foxes, that left no other signs of predation. Pigs suffered mysterious wounds that became infected and led to death. Horses developed sudden lameness that forced farmers to put them down. Mrs. Nina Patterson confided to Dr. Harding that she had lost 17 chickens in the past 2 months. "It's the strangest thing," she said. "They're dying 1 or 2 at a time, always found in the morning with their necks broken clean. My husband thinks it's foxes, but I've never seen fox sign around the coop, and the way they're killed, it's too neat too." When Harding examined the most recent casualties, he found evidence that supported Eleanor's suspicions. The chickens had been killed with precise force applied to specific points on their necks, a technique that required considerable knowledge of anatomy. It was not the random violence typical of predator attacks, but something much more deliberate and controlled. Similar patterns emerged on other farms. James Wickham had lost 3 calves to what he described as freak accidents, animals that had somehow managed to strangle themselves on ropes or wedge their heads in fence rails in ways that defied logical explanation. Robert Dunham's prize bull had fallen into a ditch and broken its leg despite being one of the most sure-footed animals in the county. In every case, the affected farms were within walking distance of the Caldwell property, and in several instances neighbors reported seeing Timothy in the vicinity around the time of the incident. "I saw him walking along our fence line the morning before we found the calf," James Wickham told Dr. Harding. "Thought it was odd, him being so far from home, but the boy was always polite when he saw me, waved and called out a greeting like he was taught proper." Dr. Harding also began paying closer attention to Timothy's behavior during his routine medical visits to the Caldwell farm. The boy was always present during these visits, standing quietly while Dr. Harding examined his aunt and uncle for the various ailments common to farming life. But Harding noticed that Timothy watched these examinations with unusual interest, asking questions about anatomy and medical procedures that seemed advanced for a child his age. "How do you know if someone's really dead?" Timothy asked during one visit, his tone casual, as if discussing the weather. "Sometimes people just look like they're sleeping." When pressed to explain his curiosity, Timothy said he was concerned about being able to help if someone was hurt while he was alone on the farm. "Uncle," Thomas says, "I need to know how to handle emergencies since we're so far from town," he explained. The explanation was reasonable, but something about the question disturbed Dr. Harding. There was a clinical quality to Timothy's interest in death and injury that went beyond normal childhood curiosity. The boy asked about the mechanics of dying, how long it took, what signs to look for, whether people could survive, various types of trauma, with the same detached interest that a medical student might show when studying cadavers. During these conversations, Harding began testing Timothy's knowledge with deliberately false information, claiming that certain injuries were fatal when they were not, or that specific symptoms indicated particular conditions. Timothy never challenged these false statements directly, but Harding noticed that the boy filed away every piece of information with remarkable retention. More disturbing still was Timothy's response to Dr. Harding's stories about treating wounded soldiers during the war. While most children showed appropriate shock or sadness when hearing about battlefield injuries, Timothy listened with rapt attention, asking detailed questions about wound patterns, blood loss, and survival rates. "Did they scream a lot when you cut off their arms?" Timothy asked during one such conversation, his pale blue eyes fixed intently on Dr. Harding's face. "Or were they too hurt to make noise?" The question, delivered in Timothy's characteristically polite tone, sent a chill through Dr. Harding that he would never forget. By November 1866, Dr. Harding had filled nearly 2 complete journals with observations about Timothy Caldwell. The picture that emerged was that of a child who possessed an adult's understanding of violence and death, combined with a complete absence of normal human empathy. But documentation was not the same as evidence. And evidence was what Harding would need if he hoped to protect the community from what he increasingly believed was a dangerous predator. The opportunity to gather that evidence came when Thomas Caldwell injured his back during the fall harvest. The injury required bed rest and daily medical visits, giving Dr. Harding unprecedented access to the Caldwell household. During these visits, he began engaging Timothy in longer conversations, carefully probing to understand the extent of the boy's knowledge and the nature of his thoughts. What he discovered exceeded his worst fears. Timothy Caldwell had been conducting experiments on living creatures for months, possibly years. Using a combination of careful questioning and direct observation, Dr. Harding determined that the boy had been systematically capturing and torturing small animals, studying their responses to various forms of injury and distress. Timothy had mentioned the cave during one of their conversations, describing it as a place where he went to think and be alone. When Dr. Harding investigated the site, he found a carefully organized collection of animal bones, crude surgical instruments fashioned from farm tools, and a series of detailed drawings that documented various experiments in torture and mutilation. The drawings were the most disturbing discovery. Rendered with surprising artistic skill for a child, they showed rabbits, squirrels, birds, and larger animals in various stages of dissection and injury. Each drawing was accompanied by notes written in Timothy's careful handwriting, describing the animal's reactions, the time it took to die, and observations about which methods caused the most suffering. Subject remained conscious for approximately 10 minutes after removal of eyes. Read one notation beside a detailed drawing of a rabbit. Vocalizations decreased gradually. Movement ceased after application of pressure to throat. Dr. Harding realized that Timothy had been using the community's animals as subjects for increasingly sophisticated experiments in cruelty. The accidental deaths on neighboring farms were actually the result of Timothy's desire to test his methods on larger subjects. But the most chilling discovery was a newer set of drawings that showed human figures instead of animals. These sketches depicted children and adults in various poses of distress and injury, each accompanied by speculative notes about human anatomy and potential methods of causing harm. One drawing showed a figure that was unmistakably Mary Fletcher, the first child to die. Another depicted Henrik Lenn. A third showed Jacob Mills at the bottom of a well with detailed annotations about the effects of dehydration and exposure on the human body. Timothy Caldwell had not simply been present when these people died. He had planned their deaths, executed those plans with methodical precision, and documented the results for future study. As Dr. Harding would soon discover, the horror in Sedalia County was far from over. If this story is giving you chills, share this video with a friend who loves dark mysteries. Hit that like button to support our content, and don't forget to subscribe to never miss stories like this. Let's discover together what happens next. Dr. Harding faced an impossible situation. The evidence in the cave proved that Timothy Caldwell was responsible for multiple deaths, but that evidence had been obtained through what amounted to illegal search. Moreover, the idea that an 8-year-old child could be a calculating murderer was so far outside the accepted understanding of human nature that no court would accept such a claim. The medical science of 1867 had no framework for understanding antisocial personality disorder or psychopathy. The prevailing belief was that children were inherently innocent, corrupted only by bad influences or traumatic experiences. The idea that a child could be born without the capacity for empathy or moral reasoning was literally inconceivable to most people. Dr. Harding knew that if he presented his findings to local authorities, he would likely be dismissed as a man whose mind had been damaged by too many years of treating war casualties. The evidence would be explained away. Timothy would be defended as a traumatized orphan acting out his grief, and the killings would continue. Instead, Dr. Harding decided to confront Timothy directly. During his next visit to the Caldwell farm, he asked the boy to walk with him to check on the livestock in the far pasture. Once they were alone, Dr. Harding revealed what he had discovered in the cave. Timothy's reaction was not what Dr. Harding had expected. The boy showed no surprise, no denial, no fear at being caught. Instead, he listened calmly as Dr. Harding described the drawings and notes, occasionally nodding as if confirming the accuracy of the doctor's observations. "You're not going to tell anyone," Timothy said. When Dr. Harding finished speaking, it was not a question or a plea, but a statement of fact delivered with absolute confidence. "Why wouldn't I?" Dr. Harding asked, genuinely curious about the boy's reasoning. Timothy smiled, the first genuine expression of emotion that Dr. Harding had ever seen on his face. "Because no one would believe you," he said, "and because you're curious about what I'll do next." The boy was right on, both counts. Dr. Harding knew that his claims would sound like the ravings of a man losing his sanity, but Timothy had also identified something that the doctor was reluctant to admit even to himself: a scientific fascination with observing the development of what might be the most dangerous human being he had ever encountered. "How long have you been doing this?" Dr. Harding asked. "Since I was 5, Timothy replied matter-of-factly. "Maybe earlier. I started with insects, then mice, then bigger things. It's interesting to see how different animals react to the same treatments and the people who died." Timothy shrugged. "They were experiments too. I wanted to see if people would react the same way as animals. They do mostly, but they're better at understanding what's happening to them. That makes it more interesting." Dr. Harding felt a chill that had nothing to do with the November air. "What are you planning to do next?" Timothy considered the question seriously before answering. "I need to find out what happens when you hurt someone who trusts you completely, someone who wouldn't suspect anything until it was too late." The implication was clear. Timothy was planning to kill his aunt and uncle. Dr. Harding knew he had perhaps days, possibly only hours, before Timothy acted on his plans. The boy had revealed his intentions with the casual confidence of someone who believed himself untouchable, and past experience suggested that Timothy did not delay once he had decided on a course of action. That evening, Dr. Harding visited Sheriff William Crawford in Sedalia. Crawford was a practical man who had served with distinction in the Union Army and had little patience for theories or speculation. But he also trusted Dr. Harding's judgment and was willing to listen to evidence regardless of how unusual the circumstances might be. Dr. Harding presented his case carefully, focusing on verifiable facts rather than psychological theories. He showed Crawford the drawings and notes from the cave, pointed out the pattern of deaths and accidents surrounding Timothy, and documented the boy's unusual knowledge of anatomy and violence. Most importantly, Dr. Harding revealed Timothy's stated intention to kill his aunt and uncle. This was information that could not be ignored regardless of the source. "Even if half of what you're telling me is true," Sheriff Crawford said after reviewing the evidence, examining each disturbing drawing with growing alarm. "We can't arrest a child for drawings and suspicions, but we can watch him, and we can be ready to act if he tries anything." Crawford studied the anatomical precision of Timothy, sketches, noting details that even his experience as a Civil War veteran hadn't prepared him for. The two men spent hours developing their strategy, bringing in Crawford's most trusted deputies, men who had served under him during the war and could be counted on to remain steady under pressure. Dr. Harding and Sheriff Crawford developed a comprehensive plan. Dr. Harding would arrive at the Caldwell farm at his usual time, bringing Ladam ostensibly for Thomas's pain management, but actually to keep both Thomas and Sarah sedated, enough to prevent Timothy from harming them easily. Sheriff Crawford and his deputies would position themselves strategically around the farm property, close enough to respond quickly but far enough away to avoid detection. The plan was put into effect the following morning. As Dr. Harding approached the farmhouse in his buggy, he noticed immediately that something was different. The usual morning ones of farm activity, chickens pecking in the yard, pigs grunting in their pen, were absent. The property held an unsettling quiet that made his skin crawl. Timothy appeared in the doorway before Dr. Harding had even climbed down from his buggy. The boy stood perfectly still, his pale blue eyes tracking the doctor's movements with predatory focus. He was dressed in his usual work clothes, but Dr. Harding noticed that Timothy's sleeves were rolled up past his elbows, and his hands appeared to have been scrubbed recently, the kind of thorough cleaning that suggested preparation for messy work. "Good morning, Dr. Harding," Timothy said, his voice carrying its characteristic politeness. But something underneath had changed. There was an anticipation there, an excitement that the boy was struggling to contain. "I've been waiting for you." The word sent a chill through Dr. Harding. Timothy's use of waiting suggested that he had been expecting this visit, had perhaps even been counting on it as part of whatever plan he had set in motion. Inside the house, Dr. Harding found Thomas and Sarah Caldwell in their bedroom, both apparently sleeping peacefully. But as he approached Thomas's bed to check his condition, he noticed that the man's breathing was unusually shallow, and his skin had taken on a grayish pallor that suggested more than natural sleep. "What did you give them?" Dr. Harding asked quietly, not turning to look at Timothy, but knowing the boy was watching every move he made. "Just some herbs I found in the woods," Timothy replied, his tone innocent but his choice of words deliberate. "There are so many interesting plants growing wild around here. Some of them have very useful properties." Dr. Harding checked Thomas's pulse and found it weak but steady. Sarah showed similar symptoms. She was deeply unconscious but still alive. Whatever Timothy had used, he had been careful about the dosage. The boy wanted his victims helpless but alive, at least for now. "They're not going to wake up for several hours." Timothy continued conversationally. "That should give us plenty of time to talk without interruption." The conversation that followed was unlike anything Dr. Harding had ever experienced. Timothy spoke about murder and torture with the clinical detachment of a medical professor discussing anatomy. He described his experiments on animals and humans with scientific precision, explaining his methodologies and the insights he had gained from each death. "Mary Fletcher taught me that drowning is actually quite slow," Timothy said, settling into a chair as if beginning a pleasant afternoon chat. "Everyone thinks people just slip under the water and disappear, but that's not how it works at all. There's struggling and panic, and this interesting pattern of breathing, attempts before the person finally gives up. I had to hold her down for almost 3 minutes before she stopped fighting." Dr. Harding felt his blood turn to ice. "You held her under the water." Timothy nodded eagerly. "She was playing by the creek, and I told her I'd found a pretty stone on the bottom. When she bent over to look, I just pushed her head down and held it there. She was so small that it didn't take much strength, but she fought harder than I expected. That's when I realized that people have much stronger survival instincts than animals. And Henrik Larsson, that was more complicated," Timothy admitted. "I couldn't overpower him physically, so I had to be more creative. I knew he checked his beehives every Thursday morning, so I went up to the bluff the night before and loosened some of the stones along the edge. Then I collected bees from one of his hives and put them in a cloth bag." Timothy's eyes gleamed as he described his methodology. "When Mr. Len climbed up to check the hives, I was waiting behind some rocks. I threw the bag of bees at his face and started shouting that there was a massive swarm attacking him. He panicked and stumbled backward right over the edge where I'd weakened the stone barrier. The fall killed him instantly, just like I calculated it would. And Jacob Mills. Jacob was the most interesting of all," Timothy said, his voice taking on the tone of a teacher, sharing a particularly fascinating lesson. "I didn't kill him quickly like the others. I wanted to see what would happen if someone died slowly over several days. So I convinced him to follow me into the woods by telling him I'd found a family of baby raccoons." Timothy paused, seeming to savor the memory. Jacob was so concerned about the imaginary baby animals that he didn't think twice about the danger. "I helped him climb down into the well. Then I moved the logs and brush to cover the opening. I visited him every day for 4 days, bringing him just enough water to keep him alive, but not enough to let him recover his strength." Dr. Harding realized that Timothy was no longer speaking hypothetically about future experiments. The boy had specific plans, and those plans clearly included the people currently in the house. "What are you planning to do with your aunt and uncle?" Dr. Harding asked directly. Timothy's genuine smile returned broader than Dr. Harding had ever seen it. "That's where you come in, Dr. Harding. See, all of my previous experiments have been with people who didn't know what was happening to them until it was too late. But you're different. You understand exactly what I am and what I'm capable of. That makes you the perfect subject for a completely new type of study." As Timothy spoke, he began moving around the room, gathering items that Dr. Harding recognized as potential weapons. Rope from the barn, a heavy candlestick from the mantelpiece, several sharp kitchen implements. The boy organized his tools with methodical precision, as if preparing for surgery, i.e. want to find out what happens when someone who knows they're going to die, Trojan, ice to save people they care about. Timothy continued, his excitement growing. "Will you sacrifice yourself to save Uncle Thomas and Aunt Sarah? Will you try to fight me even though you know I've planned for that possibility? Will you try to run away and abandon them to save yourself?" Dr. Harding knew that the time for conversation had passed. Timothy had revealed enough of his plans to make clear that everyone in the house was in immediate mortal danger. He drew the pistol from his medical bag and pointed it at the boy. "Step away from the knives, Timothy," Dr. Harding said, his voice steady despite his racing heart. Timothy looked at the pistol with interest rather than fear. "That's a Navy Colt, isn't it?" he asked conversationally. "I've seen pictures of them in books about the war. How many bullets does it hold?" 6, Dr. Harding replied automatically, then immediately regretted providing the information. "And how many people are you trying to protect?" Timothy asked. There's Uncle Thomas, Aunt Sarah, yourself, and presumably the 3 law enforcement officers outside. That's 6 people, if my counting is correct. So even if you shoot me, you'll have used up all your ammunition." Timothy moved, closer, no longer bothering to stay out of pistol range. "You want to know how I became what I am?" he said, his voice taking on an almost hypnotic quality. "You want to understand whether I was born this way or whether something made me this way. You want to know if there are others like me and how to recognize them before they start killing." Each statement was true, and Timothy's ability to identify and exploit Dr. Harding's intellectual curiosity was as frightening as his capacity for violence. The boy understood people well, enough to predict their behavior and manipulate their responses even when they knew they were being manipulated. The confrontation came as Timothy approached his sleeping uncle with a length of rope in his hands. Dr. Harding stepped forward to intervene, but Timothy moved with surprising speed and strength, producing the kitchen knife and slashing at the doctor's arm. The struggle that followed was brief but violent. Timothy fought with the desperate ferocity of a cornered animal, using the knife with skill that spoke of considerable practice. The boy was smaller and weaker than Dr. Harding, but he was also faster and more agile, and he fought with the calculated precision of someone who had studied anatomy extensively. Dr. Harding managed to grab Timothy's wrist and twist until the boy dropped the knife, but Timothy immediately produced another blade from his clothing. It became clear that the boy had prepared multiple weapons and positioned them strategically throughout the house. The sound of their fight brought Sheriff Crawford and his deputies running from their concealed positions. They burst through the back door to find Dr. Harding struggling with Timothy, while Thomas and Sarah Caldwell lay unconscious on their bed, apparently unaware of the violence occurring around them. Deputy Mitchell quickly subdued Timothy while Dr. Harding caught his breath and checked on the unconscious couple. When the dust settled, Timothy Caldwell sat calmly in the corner of the room, his clothes torn and his face bloodied, but his pale blue eyes still holding that same cold intelligence that had first disturbed Dr. Harding so many months earlier. "You can't prove anything," Timothy said as the deputies secured him with ropes. "Nobody will believe that a child did all those things." Sheriff Crawford looked down at the boy with a mixture of disgust and fascination. "Maybe not," he said. "But we don't have to prove everything. Attempting to murder your family is enough to see you locked up regardless of your age." Timothy smiled at that. The same genuine expression of emotion that Dr. Harding had seen the day before. "You won't hang me," he said with absolute confidence. "I'm too young and I'm too interesting. Someone will want to study me instead." Just when we thought we'd seen it all, the horror in Sedalia County intensifies. If this story is giving you chills, share this video with a friend who loves dark mysteries. Hit that like button to support our content, and don't forget to subscribe to never miss stories like this. Let's discover together what happens next. Timothy Caldwell was wrong about his fate, but right about the impossibility of proving his crimes. When Sheriff Crawford attempted to present the evidence from the cave to county prosecutors, he encountered exactly the resistance that Dr. Harding had predicted. The drawings and notes were dismissed as the products of a disturbed child acting out trauma from his parents' deaths. The pattern of accidents and deaths was attributed to coincidence compounded by Timothy's unfortunate habit of being helpful during emergencies. The attempted murder of Thomas and Sarah Caldwell, however, could not be explained away. 3 law enforcement officers had witnessed Timothy attacking his sleeping relatives with clear intent to kill. Even the most sympathetic observers could not argue that an 8-year-old boy would attack family members with a knife unless something fundamental was wrong with his character. The legal system of 1867 had no framework for dealing with violent children. Timothy was too young for adult prosecution, but too dangerous for simple placement in an orphanage or reformatory. The case created unprecedented challenges for Missouri's justice system, attracting attention from legal scholars and medical professionals throughout throughout the region. After weeks of legal wrangling and consultation with experts from as far away as Boston and Philadelphia, a compromise was reached. Timothy would be remanded to the custody of the Missouri State Hospital for the Insane in Fulton, where he would be studied and treated by the most advanced alienists available in the region. The decision satisfied no one completely. Prosecutors wanted Timothy tried as an adult for murder, while defense attorneys argued that no child so young could be held responsible for his actions. Medical professionals were divided between those who believed Timothy could be rehabilitated and those who considered him incurably dangerous. Dr. Samuel Harding volunteered to accompany Timothy to the hospital and remained there for 3 months, documenting the boy's behavior and working with hospital staff to develop understanding of what they were dealing with. The resulting case study became one of the first systematic examinations of antisocial behavior in children, though it would not be published until decades after the events. Timothy adapted to hospital life with the same calculating intelligence he had shown on the farm. He quickly learned to mimic appropriate emotions and responses, convincing several staff members that he was making remarkable progress in overcoming his traumatic episodes. Timothy would cry convincingly when discussing his crimes, express remorse that seemed genuine, and display what appeared to be authentic gratitude for the care he was receiving. But Dr. Harding observed that Timothy was merely studying the people around him, learning to manipulate them more effectively. The boy had created what amounted to a comprehensive catalogue of human emotional responses, and he could reproduce these signals with remarkable accuracy despite feeling none of the underlying emotions himself. The subject displays remarkable cognitive abilities coupled with complete absence of genuine emotional response. Dr. Harding wrote in his detailed reports, "He has learned to simulate normal human reactions with sufficient skill to deceive casual observers. But extended observation reveals the performance to be entirely artificial. Timothy understands happiness as the face people make when they want something good to continue, and sadness as the face people make when they want others to help them. But he has never actually experienced either motion himself." Dr. Harding's evaluation also revealed the extent of Timothy's violent fantasies and future plans. When the boy believed he had gained Dr. Harding's trust by pretending to be fascinated by the scientific approach to studying human behavior, Timothy began sharing ideas for future experiments that made his past crimes seem almost restrained by comparison. He has developed elaborate scenarios for testing human responses to various forms of psychological and physical torture. Dr. Harding reported confidentially, "His plans demonstrate remarkable creativity and attention to detail, as well as a sophisticated understanding of human psychology. If he were allowed to mature and gain additional resources, he would likely become one of the most dangerous individuals in American history." The hospital records show that Timothy remained at the facility for 18 months. During that time, several unexplained incidents occurred that bore the hallmarks of Timothy's methods. Other patients were found dead in circumstances that suggested accident or natural causes, but which showed patterns of deliberate planning when examined carefully. 3 elderly patients died from apparent heart failure after interacting with Timothy, though all had been in relatively good health previously. 2 younger patients suffered what appeared to be accidental falls that resulted in serious injuries. But both incidents occurred in areas where Timothy had been seen earlier in the day. Most disturbing were the reports of patients who claimed Timothy had been visiting them at night, standing silently beside their beds and watching them sleep. Hospital staff who worked closely with Timothy also began experiencing unusual problems. Several nurses reported persistent nightmares after spending time with the boy, dreams that often featured detailed scenarios of violence and death. 2 attendants requested transfers to other wards, claiming that they felt constantly watched even when Timothy was supposedly confined to his room. Dr. Martha Fitzgerald, who had been brought in to provide the additional expertise in treating Timothy, discovered that the boy had been keeping a secret journal. Timothy had convinced one of the nurses to provide him with paper and pencil for therapeutic writing exercises, claiming that recording his thoughts and feelings would help him process his emotions more effectively. The journal appeared to contain exactly what Timothy had claimed: daily entries describing his thoughts, his regrets about past actions, and his hopes for future rehabilitation. The writing was appropriately childlike in its language and emotional content, and it painted a picture of a deeply troubled but fundamentally redeemable young person struggling to overcome traumatic experiences. But Dr. Fitzgerald's training in European psychiatric techniques included familiarity with coded communication systems. When she applied analytical methods to Timothy's journal, she discovered that the innocent-seeming entries contained a sophisticated cipher system. The decoded messages revealed Timothy's true thoughts and plans in disturbing detail. Rather than experiencing remorse or rehabilitation, he was conducting a systematic study of the hospital, its staff, and its security procedures. His goal was not merely to escape, but to use his time in confinement to develop more advanced techniques for manipulation and murder. Day 47. Dr. F. believes my tears during today's session were authentic. Read 1. Decoded entry. Her response pattern indicates increased sympathy and reduced suspicion. Estimate 3 more weeks of consistent performance will be required to establish sufficient trust for physical contact during sessions. The discovery of Timothy's coded journal led to an immediate tightening of security procedures and a reduction in his contact with hospital staff. But Timothy adapted to these changes with characteristic flexibility, shifting his focus from manipulators to information, gathering about hospital routines and potential escape routes. In the summer of 1868, Timothy Caldwell disappeared from the Missouri State Hospital under circumstances that were never fully explained. The official investigation concluded that he had somehow managed to escape during a transfer between buildings despite being under constant supervision by multiple guards. Dr. Harding suspected that Timothy's escape had been far more sophisticated than the official report suggested. The boy had demonstrated remarkable patience and planning ability throughout his confinement, and it seemed likely that he had spent months preparing for his departure. Evidence discovered after Timothy's disappearance suggested that he had been manipulating the facility staff far more successfully than anyone had realized. Several guards reported having made small policy exceptions for Timothy in the weeks before his escape, allowing him slightly longer exercise periods, providing him with additional reading materials, making minor adjustments to his daily routine that individually seemed harmless but collectively may have created opportunities for escape. He spent 1.5 years studying that facility and its personnel. Dr. Harding wrote in his final report on the case. By the time he made his move, he understood the psychology of every person who worked there better than they understood themselves. His escape wasn't an act of desperation. It was the culmination of a carefully executed plan. In the months and years following Timothy's disappearance, Dr. Harding began collecting reports of suspicious deaths and accidents throughout the Midwest. Many of these incidents bore hallmarks that seemed consistent with Timothy's methods. Carefully staged accidents that resulted in death, evidence of systematic torture of animals, and the presence of a child who seemed unusually helpful and emotionally mature. The challenge was that Timothy would now be older, potentially strong enough to overpower adult victims, and certainly sophisticated enough to avoid the mistakes that had led to his original capture. His time of intensive study in human psychology, combined with his natural intelligence and complete lack of moral restraint, had created something unprecedented in American criminal history. Dr. Harding spent the remaining years of his career tracking these reports and attempting to develop a comprehensive understanding of what Timothy Caldwell represented. His private journals, discovered after his death in 1891, contained hundreds of pages documenting cases that might have involved Timothy, along with theoretical discussions about the nature of evil and the possibility that some individuals might be born without the capacity for moral reasoning. The broader implications of Timothy's case continued to influence discussions about criminal justice, child psychology, and mental health treatment for decades after his disappearance. His ability to deceive trained professionals raised uncomfortable questions about the reliability of psychiatric evaluation, while his manipulative skills highlighted the potential dangers of assuming that all children are inherently innocent and redeemable. The Caldwell farm was abandoned after Thomas and Sarah recovered from their ordeal. Neither could bear to remain in the place where they had unknowingly harbored a killer for nearly 2 years. The property eventually reverted to the county and was sold to developers in the 1890s, but local residents avoided the area for decades afterward. The cave where Timothy had conducted his experiments was sealed by Sheriff Crawford shortly after the boy's arrest, but the location was never forgotten by those who knew of its significance. Local legend claimed that the cave was cursed and that animals would not graze in the surrounding area. Dr. Harding's journals were donated to the Missouri Historical Society in 1923 by his daughter, who felt that the scientific value of her father's observations outweighed concerns about the disturbing nature of the content. The journals remain in the Society's archives, available to researchers who can demonstrate legitimate academic interest in the development of psychological understanding. Thomas and Sarah Caldwell never spoke publicly about their experience with Timothy, but both lived under assumed names for the remainder of their lives, apparently fearing that the boy might someday return to finish what he had started. Sarah died in 1889, and Thomas followed in 1894. Neither ever had children of their own. In his final journal entry, written just days before his death in 1891, Dr. Harding reflected on the broader implications of Timothy's case. "I have spent 24 years trying to understand what Timothy Caldwell represented, and I fear I have reached a disturbing conclusion. Timothy was not an aberration. He was a glimpse into what human beings might become when stripped of the moral and emotional constraints that we consider fundamental to our nature. If he survived to adulthood, then somewhere in America there walks a man who understands human psychology better than any trained professional, who can manipulate people with supernatural skill, and who views the rest of humanity as nothing more than subjects for experimentation. This mystery shows us that evil can wear the face of innocence, and that our assumptions about childhood and human nature may be dangerously naive. The case of Timothy Caldwell forces us to confront uncomfortable questions about the nature of moral development and the possibility that some individuals may be born without the capacity for empathy or conscience that we consider fundamental to humanity. What do you think of this story? Do you believe everything was revealed, or might there be more to Timothy Caldwell's fate than the official records suggest? Leave your comment below and let us know your thoughts about this disturbing chapter in American history. If you enjoyed this tale and want more horror stories like this, subscribe, hit the notification bell, and share with someone who loves mysteries as dark and complex as this one. Remember, the truth is often more terrifying than fiction, and history holds secrets that continue to challenge our understanding of human nature. See you in the next video.